Racist officer assumes black man stole his own car. What happened next shocked the neighborhood. Jason Carter is sailing across his affluent local in his elegant black Porsche. Feels a sense of achievement. Small does he know his the world is ready to be inverted. From one traffic stop, what transpires the next will test all he has ever assumed he understood about justice and music. Kelly Anderson, the equality officer, drives, her eyes roaming the streets, searching the perfect lawns and elegant homes. She cannot get rid of an uncomfortable feeling as she observes the house. Her former convictions influencing her perspective on Jason's automobile enters into appearance. Anything seems strange. She squints, chooses what to do. The flash from here of blue and red lights behind his rearview mirror starts Jason from his calm. His brow creases as he steers his car to the curb, ignorant of the suffering he will experience. The weight of what is still to come floats in the air, invisible though clearly as Officer Anderson walks up to the car. Her hands fall on her holster, revealing a straightforward approach. Preparation for facing her stern aura shows mistrust as she approaches the side window of the driver. Though his heart racing, Jason stays cool. Outside, completely aware of the hazards of displaying any indicators of disturbance yet. What follows is entirely unexpected and horrible. License and registration. Anderson requests her voice, flavored with an edge that hints at this goes beyond a standard traffic stop. Jason agrees without thinking twice, his motions slow and deliberate as he gets the desired records from. As he hands them the glove compartment over, he finds it impossible to ignore the officer's dubious stare, her eyes flying between his face and the luxury car he's sitting in. Anderson looks at the documents with too much detail, her brows wrinkled in incredulity. "This is your automobile?" she asks, clearly not accepting it. Jason nods, battling to maintain his voice steady as he answers, "Ma'am, I recently acquired my new automobile." Lately, the officer's eyes focus narrow. Not convinced, "Get out of the car," she commands, her free hand now tightly clutching Jason's. Calmness in her holster wavers for a moment when uncertainty and dread cover over. He inhales deeply to remind him of his rights. "I could inquire, goo officer," he asks, his tone polite, still bursting with increasing discomfort. Michael's stance stiffens, her voice assuming a more forceful tone. "We have recorded of a stolen car fitting this. Now get out of the car." The charges loom large in the atmosphere, each word a blow to Jason's dignity. He experiences an explosion of wrath developing within him, but knowing that sharing it could aggravate, Jason gradually discloses the circumstances too. Automobile door moving deliberately as he standing. He finds he gets rather conscious of inquisitive neighbors coming out of their houses, drawn in line with the movement. Their eyes dart between him and the police, mixed worry with judgment drawing their faces. Anderson starts down pat Jason. Her touch is really harsh and detached. "Decent ride for a young black man like you." Her comments dripped with accusation. "How do you respond? You can afford something like this." Jason could clearly see the question stinging him. This was happening just due of the tint of his skin. Jason finds difficulty to remain calm as the shame at being handled like a criminal in his own area cleanses over him. He is aware of the weight of the viewer's step on, whispers carrying on the breeze. His mind races, ripped apart midway between claiming his rights and avoiding any behavior that could be observed. As Anderson, the resistance officer, perceiving the increasingly large viewership, seems to double down on her behavior, her motions start to more forceful. Her voice sounded like to rationalize her doubts for the gathering. "Everyone, spread your legs," she barks at Jason's feet to open. Jason shuts his eyes for a moment and settles himself when he opens. He looks steadily. His voice is clearly good. "Under control, officer," says every word measured and clear. "I would like to appeal for support. I think there has been a Officer Anderson from the misinterpretation questions. Jason seeks help from someone else. Jason considers his known neighbors. He turns yearning for help for years. Still sees Mrs. Susan Harris from across the street, steps onto her porch, arms tightly crossed over her chest. She's knowing him from his early years, observing. He becomes the decent young man. Her brows now show wrinkles as she accepts the scene. Close by, Mr. Thomas, usually grinning from his corner store, tilts against his door frame with doubt in his eyes. Jason's look requests their assistance, but their reluctance reveals his mental state. Jason's races while he stands there unmoving. Raised, he is quite aware of how this appears. A young black man facing confrontation from the cops, treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. The need to yell, to protect oneself, so that everyone, understanding the injustice of the condition, burns in his throat, but he drinks it down with knowledge that any performance of hostility could make things worse. Officer Anderson senses the pressure of the observer eyes with every. She gets increasingly restless during passing moments. Rising in voice, she repeated her demands. I have to see some, sir, identification. Today the presence of the expanding audience seemed to strengthen her while driving her to further exercise her authority even further. Jason inhales deeply with power. He was trying to slow his beating heart when speaks softly and calmly, but he was really annoyed over the entire scenario. Officer, I have already mentioned, I reside here and am not in my automobile, grabbing for anything until you tell me. Why am I being held? Based on gathered neighbors look at one another, their reactions rich in judgment. Some shake their minds, whirling over children these days, and kindly assist the cops. Others sit in awkward quiet, not sure how to respond to the scene since Jason's standoff stretches on and makes a decision, experiencing the suffering of the slow spread of neighbors' disloyalty. Is for his phone. His hands are solid. I'm going to ask for help, he declares. I wish to be sure my rights are. Officer Anderson tenses her under protection, hand naturally pointing in her direction. Holster, sir, put the phone down. I haven't granted license to make any calls. The environment thickens with suspense. Neighbors lean forward, observing closely. Given the circumstances which teeter on, Jason's finger glides over escalation, his jaw set in resolve on the screen. In this moment, he is not only battling for himself, but for each individual who is ever been falsely accused, every life turned upside down by unbridled prejudice. The weight of the event settles over the street like a heavy blanket. Every person, including current Jason, Officer Anderson, and the silent watchers, discover themselves at their actions at the following few crossroads. Events will spread, influencing not just only this meeting, yet the very fabric of their community as the tea standoff in between Jason and Officer Anderson hits a breaking point for police. Suddenly, cruiser drives up to the scene and superior cop walks out with composure. Stern also exuded this kind of power. Regarding him as he got ready, his eyes open. What is happening here? The perfect seemed like the savior that will call off all this. He was older, combining salt and pepper hair with a face surrounded by years of handling strained circumstances similar to this, or so Jason believed. But something about his movement caught me, directed toward Officer Anderson, and the appearance traded among them right away sent Jason shivered down his spine. This wasn't a rescue, was something far worse. As the higher officer arrived to take position, looking at the scene beside Anderson, his steady, methodical look pointed, his eyes fixed upon Jason's for a second. There was a frightening quiet then in a voice so subdued and serene. It was almost conversational, the way "Another one," said the superior officer nicely, trying to press his luck. Jason's heart dropped. He had been looking for this man to provide some sort of structure for fixing Officer Anderson and fix the circumstances. Instead, he now understood that the man before him wasn't here to Help he was here to confirm the dream that become. Jason gazed at the neighbors here, expecting someone would intervene to assist, but what he observed made him even more depressed. The neighbors who had initially come out of their disoriented homes were now more brave and confident. They were chatting among themselves and trading looks with varying degrees of smugness. Pleasure to silence apathy. It was as though the entrance of extra cops had validated their concerns about Jason. Even though he did nothing illegal, the weight of their assessment pushed down on him like a breaking wave. The superior officer bent in toward Anderson, chatting just loud enough for Jason hears. He is postponing radio and for backup will help us ensure this doesn't. Jason was rapidly getting rather serious. Terrified now, what exactly did they mean? He wasn't fighting, he had done nothing wrong, but the way the higher officer stated it so gently, almost bored, sent a terrible message this conveyed regarding more. He was in the midst, not only with his car, of something considerably darker, something he hadn't quite understood until recently. They weren't treating him like someone to think, they were treating him like a menace that demanded to be. Michael, a neutralized cop, grinned as she raised her radio with great obedience, asking for extra units to my spot. She mentioned, her voice sounded at eager. We have a maybe dangerous. Jason seems to have virtually stopped breathing. Hazardous he had not spoken out against. Yet here they were getting ready for a whole display of might. He retreated a step. His eyes followed the expanding assembly of neighbors, their faces confused together. A few of them are capturing the moment, others among themselves, but none whispering among themselves. None of them moved to assist him, appeared to worry. The knowledge that struck him like several tons of bricks. He was absolutely alone. The quiet on the street was crazed solely by the crackle of radio memories. Later for Officer Michael, the siren wail sliced across the heavens, getting louder every second that passed. Jason's heart hammered inside his chest as the second police poly cruiser stopped, its flashing lights creating horrific shadows on the features of the two more cops emerged from the sidelines. Their hands came naturally to rest on their holsters as they got to the scenario. Jason saw them attempting to evaluate whether they would introduce some degree of cause of the current state, but the appearance on their faces revealed differently. But they were come to assist their fellow police. No inquiries made to the higher officer gave them a quick nod meant for they should arrange themselves around Jason. For officers in all were present now, everyone positioned at a different point about him, forming a circle that seemed less like a defense mechanism and more like a trap shutting in. Jason could sense his heart in his throat. He breathed, deepening. The ground under his feet seemed to slow down, every detail sharpener, hence more frightening. The illumination of the officers' badges, the little variations in their angles, the cold metal of the handcuffs fastened on their belts, this all enhanced the growing awareness of something awful was about to transpire. One of the recently hired police officers absorbed the scene. His eye landed on Jason's phone, still grasped in his fingers. The officer's expression instantly changed. Put the phone down, he commanded. Nobody has given you allowed me to note. Jason's hand closed around his last phone call, lifeline to the outer world he missed, recording he had not even considered. Press the button under the heat of the moment, but now as the cops drew near, he understood the significance of it. Just now, seize this chance to record what was occurring should something go wrong. An instant's control, but prior to his answer, the officer of superior standing moved forward, his hand on his radio, staring at Jason's. Had a glance that transmitted ice based on his veins. We are not going to allow you to video us. His voice was low, yet somewhat frightening. You believe you will find use for this against us? Not today. Jason's heart battered in his chest as the officer's words sank in. Not this time. What did that meant? They were organizing something. His head flew as he sought to fit In general, the more he, considering it, the more horrible the. Realizing this, he looked at the cops all around him, each one poised, then ready, their hand palms inches apart from their weapons, created the tension in the atmosphere to be strong and choking. The street, once calm today, felt like a pressure cooker near the brink of bursting. Jason's eyes turned to the neighbors, once more covertly begging for someone to cover for another, saying something, yet their features were plain, their eyes cold. Even Mrs. Susan Harris, who had known when he was a young child, standing, she watched with her arms crossed, scene unfold with detached inquiry. Jason felt his tummy turn. They weren't going to assist him. They weren't doing anything. It was then that Jason heard it, a voice emanating from the radio the superior officer had in hand. Verify there is no remaining video. Behind his blood flowed frigid. They were preparing to wipe everything. Delete. Panic ran across Jason's body. His mind shouted at him to dash to get it out of nowhere, but he knew that any abrupt movement would constitute a death sentence. He, unable to walk, unable to call for aid. Every alternative felt to be a trap. The voice of a superior officer shattered through. Your ideas allow you to push back. You have few choices, son. You can either comply, else we will make this much more difficult. Regarding, Jason looked at him, the surroundings reflecting. He seemed to get closer in weight of the moment, hovering above him like a hammer. Every instinct in his body informed. He knew but he would try to resist. Horrific truth, he was alone. Jason sensed a steady rising tension, caught somewhere between the cops and the clear eyes of the neighborhood, but then anything in the higher officers. He squinted at Jason as behavior changed. Should one try to situate him momentarily, it seemed to indicate the man was experiencing second ideas, but his face changed rapidly. Jason understood this wasn't quite. Hardened once more. Over then, as though by a stroke of fate, one of the more recent graduates, Officer Scott, who had come in the second cruiser, moved forward to examine closely at Jason. Claimed he looked for a moment in between the others before gently, apparently reluctant but approaching Jason, clearly but interested in seeing you. Before Jason took a hard gulp, his voice dense with a longing to be heard but still regulated. I am not criminal. I am a college student attending legal school. Look, I really live in this neighborhood. You currently have the wrong man. Scott hesitated at something in Jason's tone, forcing him to stop his academic education. He questioned his doubts, therefore lowering the superior officer turned angrily at Scott, but let him carry on. Officer Anderson. Still, she held stiff hands on. Her eyes darkened as she pulled her holstered, spoke in a voice bursting with disbelievement. Does not fit his explanations. We have followed someone who fits his description, a black man in his mid-20s, upscale vehicle, breaking into our network and revealing officer personal data. Michael's words conveyed a chill. Jason seemed to have everything so perfect, absurd, that he virtually laughed. He not knew anything about hacking, and with the only thing he gave thought to with the police were avoiding them. But Officer Scott shined his grimace, shaking his. This does not stack up headwise. I have seen this man quietly, he said, prior at a community function, I believe. You are Jason Carter, right? Then turned fully to Jason, his posture more calm. Jason blinked in surprise, suggesting of hope igniting in his chest. Yep, that's me. I help out in nearby events. I want to be a judge like my father. Father Scott nodded gently at the bits. Definitely clicking into place. Here is where I remember you from my young brothers. Last month, the school had a career day. You were among the ones who were. Jason nodded, feeling a little bit relief, but the icy look from Anderson was still there. Then she moved forward, her expression becoming stiffening even more. I'm not bothered about his whereabouts. Matches the profile and drives an automobile that resembles the one mentioned here exactly. Snatched last week. Scott peered at the Good officer for direction, but the expression of the higher officer stayed same. Untreadable. His hand stayed in his radio. Scott then insisted they had to run this. Appropriately, he might not be the man. Their search has been for Anderson. Wasn't listening. Her eyes stayed still. Focused on Jason. Her jaw tightened. She was thinking of her lifetime of accumulated prejudice. Thinking back to the lessons her father been pushed into her from her early years. Black males in luxury automobiles are criminals. She could hear the father's merciless voice in her mind expressing words she had sought to forget but couldn't get away from. This more than for her, traffic stops were a battle to prove herself, to uphold the nasty ideas she had carried for much too long. Jason could see it on her face. Her contempt wasn't only business but personal as well. She considered him as not a college student, neighbor, even a human being. He was just another to her. First stereotyped one she had been trained to hate, and that is when something inside Jason recorded. He inhaled and got taller, his voice serene but forceful. You know, Officer Anderson, you hardly have bothered to run my plates right. You have seen. You came upon this car and made an presumption derived from the hue of mine. Michael's eyes sparkled with wrath. Yet before she could say anything, Scott moved in between them. We must follow the guidelines. Let me check his plates. Once more examine his license and work out actually what is happening. Here the higher officer, spotting the movement in the air, nodded silently. Still, Anderson stayed furious. Her fists closing at her sides, but she said nothing as Scott rapidly rushed to review Jason's registration and run the plates. Seemed to slink slowly each second, since as an hour as Jason loomed there like the weight of the planet was on him. He could see Anderson's rigid body reflecting wrath simply below the surface, poised to blow. This went beyond the car or the expected hacker. This related to something far deeper, something ugly. At last, Scott came back bearing the results on his portable gadget. The car's clean, he whispered softly. Registration checks out. No. Jason's reports of it being taken exhaled, gradually the weight lifting somewhat from his chest, yet it wasn't over. He could still see Anderson's eyes fixed on him. Angry, scorching. I told Jason said. You have the incorrect superiors, man. Officer let out a long sigh, stroking his temples as the conflict released from the scenario. Seems like we made a mistake. His voice carried an apology here. Conversely, Anderson on the other side seemed like she was about to blow this back off. Makes sense, she pointed angrily at Jason, as though the truth were somehow his responsibility. Matches his profile. He must be concealing something. Scott shook his head and now said with firm voice, Anderson, let it go. We were mistaken here. Isn't our guy. But Anderson wasn't ready to allow years of animosity built on years on. The cornerstone of her violent father's teachings bubbled over in her. She wasn't. She was the outcome right now, a cop of the poisonous legacy left by her father, and she was about going to buckle beneath the weight. The higher officer suddenly spoke, his chilly voice. Anderson, enough. Stop for a moment. It felt like Michael might not pay her hand any attention. Hovered close to her holster, and she was swiftly and hard. Then, as though she grasped the gravity of the matter, she stopped gently. Then her hand slipped to on her side, but her eyes never left Jason, and the hate that pervaded there was unmistakable. The superior officer's voice softened little when he talked. Addressed Jason, we'll get this sorted out. You're free to go, sir. But Jason wasn't done. He wasn't going to just walk away from this. You assume this is sorted out? He asked, his voice harsher now. You targeted me because of the color of my skin. You didn't examine the facts. You just projected. The neighbors who had been seeing silently started to communicate among themselves the reality of what had just lately settled over them. First, then, to everyone's shock, Officer Anderson cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her father's bigotry and her own failures ultimately devastated her. Voice shook as she stated was simply doing her work. No, Jason remarked, his voice calm, but sharp. You weren't, you were being racist. And now you'll have to live with the
consequences.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.